On November 8th,
I like the way that Scary Interesting does his videos. This is a really good YouTube channel.
1972, an aircraft took off over one of the most desolate and isolated stretches of the Canadian North. The plane was carrying 2 passengers who were in desperate need of medical attention at a larger city with proper medical equipment.
Okay.
However, later that evening, the plane never arrived at its destination, and the whereabouts of the plane and crew wouldn't be known for some time afterward.
It's not good.
When it was finally learned what really happened, it was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. As always, viewer discretion is advised.
Arctic survival. Hey, I'm watching videos about some things that are really scary. Hey, my balls are really hairy. Just lick 'em.
The Canadian territory of Nunavut is an incredibly isolated place, with no roads connecting it.
Wait, does this not look like a cow that's upside down? Look at this. Massive breast, because cows have breasts, right?
With the rest of Canada.
Phenomenal.
And a population of just over 36,000 spread across its gigantic landmass. It holds the title of the most sparsely populated region of any major country on Earth.
Ooh,
Within
phenomenal.
this territory sits the tiny hamlet of Cambridge Bay on Victoria Island, which is somehow even more isolated. Just 1,760 people live in this small commercial fishing spot. On top of the isolation here, winter temperatures drop to a staggering -35 degrees.
Yeah, you can keep
and
that.
And from late November to January, the sun sits below the horizon in the long polar night. Residents here, who are mainly indigenous, can go for months without seeing day.
My God. Dude, the thing that is crazy about stuff like this is like, how did you get these houses up? Like, it's freezing outside. So imagine building a house when it's absolutely freezing outside, especially this massive one. But imagine building all of these houses, not only the houses, but the roads. I assume they're not like concrete, right? Are they concrete? What else are you driving on? Ice? Like what? Dude, I need to understand how they build these cities. Can someone make a video on that?
Daylight, instead living their lives by the glow of the magnetic auroras. People also rarely, if ever, leave the island, with generations of families having resided here, entirely cut off from the rest of the world.
True.
And naturally, as you might imagine in such a remote environment, emergency services can be scarce.
Phenomenal.
Although this has improved in recent years, back in the 1970s, there were no medical centers or hospitals serving Cambridge Bay or its surrounding villages.
My God.
Instead, residents relied on charter pilots to evacuate them in the case of life-threatening medical emergencies, no matter how severe the weather. One of these pilots was a man named Martin Hartwell.
Okay.
Born in Germany in 1925, Martin lived most of his life under the name Leopold Hermann.
1925.
This was his name while training with the German Air Force during the Second World War, as well as with the Luftwaffe, and understandably something he preferred
100 years ago. 101 years ago.
Martin was supposedly fairly quiet in general and kept his private life mostly to himself, having married in Germany and fathering a son before emigrating to Canada in 1967 alone.
All right, I'm off to work, bro. You have a good stream. Yo,
By
I appreciate you already.
At the age of 47,
you have a good day at work.
He landed a job with
Go save them kids. You're a lifeguard, right? I mean, that'd sound weird if you weren't. Have a good day, bro.
Gateway Aviation. This airline specialized in short regional flights and cargo, and he had logged around 2,000 hours of flight time overall. He was, by all measures, a seasoned pilot.
I have more time than that in, like, GTA 5. That's crazy.
Some even consider him among the best in the company. Even despite this, though, Martin lacked confidence when flying over the Canadian tundra, which was a much more expansive and unpredictable landscape than his native Germany. Things were much more eerie in the vast emptiness, not to mention challenging weather and low visibility made winter flights particularly dangerous. And although they were a reputable airline, Gateway Aviation allegedly had a habit of pressuring pilots into accepting flights they weren't ready for, supposedly leading to several crashes in the months leading up to November of 1972.
That's a plane. I didn't even notice.
On November 8th, 1972, Martin arrived in Cambridge Bay after dropping off some prospectors at a nearby lake.
My God.
He was then due to fly onto Swan Lake near the Arctic coast, but bad weather left him stranded for a little longer than anticipated. So without plans, he settled down for a quiet afternoon, or at least he did, until he received news that required his urgent attention. A flight had just arrived from nearby Spence Bay, and its passengers desperately needed a pilot to transport them to the neighboring territory's capital, Yellowknife. Judy Hill, a 27-year-old British nurse, was escorting
Dude,
two
the editing
patients,
on this is cool.
a heavily pregnant 25-year-old Inuk woman named Nimi, and her nephew, a 14-year-old with severe appendicitis named David.
Excuse me. Nimi is
These
a pretty
patients
name.
were extremely high risk, and without evacuation,
Nimi.
Judy worried their conditions would decline rapidly.
Nimi.
Nimi had gone into premature labor, and having already lost 2 pregnancies due to complications, it was critical that she be seen in hospital as soon as possible. And David was also getting worse, his condition having progressed over the past few days to near
That's just a
constant
kid.
stomach cramps and vomiting. So, despite the weather, they needed a pilot who would make the effort anyway.
Gosh.
Martin then weighed up the opportunity. It was a particularly icy day with snow coating the ground, and as the afternoon wore on, he knew that night would make for even more challenging conditions.
Gosh, bro.
He was cautious, to say the least, given the gaps in his knowledge, not to mention that he only had 30 hours of experience in his new plane, a Beechcraft 18. The pilot from Spence Bay, Ed, also volunteered to help, so the two spent some time figuring out who should
Yeah,
go.
what a legend. Say, I'll help.
On the one hand, Ed was much more confident and well qualified.
Is that the air? Is that the
He was
runway?
what's known as an instrument-rated pilot, having undergone training
my
that allowed
God.
him to rely on cockpit equipment, not just visual aids and landmarks, while flying. His plane, a Twin Otter DH-C6, also came equipped with wing
Which one's
de-icers
better?
that would help with the freezing conditions. But unlike Martin, Ed was booked for a flight the next day to Coppermine in the opposite direction to Yellowknife. It would be much further out of his way, plus his aircraft was already carrying an hour's less fuel. So Ed eventually decided to decline so Martin could take the flight, and Martin knew he couldn't refuse. It was crucial that he get these patients where they needed to be. There was just no other choice. And so with that, Martin began to load up his aircraft. Nimi and David were then wheeled on board on stretchers, while Judy took a spot in the co-pilot seat. At around 3:30 p.m., Martin readied himself for takeoff. The sky was darker than it had been an hour ago, and there was a thick fog in the air, but as the
Oh
plane
my
climbed and the air
God.
gradually cleared, Martin felt reassured that he was making the right decision. A short while later, Judy brought Martin a cup of coffee before falling asleep peacefully right next to him. Nimi and David were also quiet in the cabin behind them. At 5:10 p.m., the aircraft approached an area known as Contuito Lake. The route between Cambridge Bay
said
and Yellowknife
5
contained
hours?
very few waypoints
My
where pilots could
God.
determine their course and position, but Contuito Lake was one of them, and as such, it was home to a small radio beacon. This made it a key milestone for anyone flying this route. However, for such an important crossing, this radio beacon was inadequate. For years, pilots had complained about its weak and unreliable signal.
Oh,
And
no.
unfortunately, on that afternoon, for Martin, it would be no exception. Although he thought he was less than 30 kilometers away from the beacon, he couldn't get a signal anywhere. Brushing this aside, though, Martin continued the flight as the sky got darker and darker. Unbeknownst to him, however, his
That'd
plane
be
was
so
drifting
scary,
far off course to
flying in the
west,
dark.
and as he continued alone and without a radio signal, his compass began to oscillate wildly. This wasn't uncommon on flights close to the poles, but for Martin, losing this navigational aid would be disastrous.
Oh, no.
Unlike instrument-rated pilots like Ed, Martin lacked the qualification required to navigate primarily using instruments instead of visual signals. Losing his compass and with the skies increasingly murky, he became increasingly disoriented. He then brought the plane down to a lower altitude of 2,000 feet and he reached for his map light, but while doing so, he accidentally flicked on his cabin lights, illuminating the aircraft and drowning out his vision in the process. Within minutes, he lost control of the aircraft and plummeted violently into the side of a hill.
Oh, my God.
Hundreds of kilometers away, as the hours passed and there was no plane, emergency services at Yellowknife realized something was wrong. A search then immediately began for the lost flight and went deep into the night, battling rain, snow, and blizzards, only to find absolutely nothing. Nobody had a clue that 400 kilometers away, near Hotel Lake and far away from any civilization, Martin was waking up to a nightmare. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious for. Opening his eyes, the plane burned ahead of him, and the wreckage was scattered across the forest and ice. Martin then steadied himself and tried to stand up, but he couldn't move.
Legs
Then
were
he
broke.
looked down and saw the lifeless body of Judy lying motionless across him. She had died instantly upon impact. As the shock subsided,
Oh my
Martin realized
God,
he also
bro.
couldn't move his
Trauma.
legs. The crash
Not
had not only knocked him
phenomenal.
unconscious, but snapped both of his ankles, leaving him unable to walk. Then, nearby, horrifyingly, Nimi had broken her back, and tragically, within a couple of hours, she would pass away along with her unborn child. The only other person
R.I.P.
on board
Nimi.
to survive the accident was David, who had miraculously come out unscathed apart from bruises. However, not only was he weak, seriously ill, and just 14, but David had never once left the island community he grew up in. His survival skills were virtually non-existent, but he was resilient and willing to listen, and with no other choice, the pair would need to act quickly as temperatures
Remember,
soon
this
dropped
kid's
to
sick,
negative
too.
40 degrees.
He's sick as well.
On that first night, David managed to construct a shelter from pieces of tarp, fir trees, and sleeping bags from the plane. Under Martin's instructions, David then gathered wood and chopped it to get a fire going to warm them. The next day, they took stock of what supplies they had. Fortunately, the plane came equipped with a survival kit, which contained, in addition to the sleeping bags, a set of rations that was about enough food to last 4 people 10 days. There were 6 cans of corned beef, 4 packets of chicken noodle soup, 12 stock cubes, 350 grams of rice, around 5 powdered potatoes, glucose pills, and a dozen small packets of raisins.
Powdered potatoes. Okay, those are
And
good.
this was in addition to the food the other passengers had been carrying, as Judy herself had taken a small supply of sandwiches on board. Given that there were only 2 of them, David and Martin could likely use these provisions to extend their survival time to around 3 weeks at the absolute maximum. But although they had a decent amount of food, the main problem would be the quickly approaching and
cold.
absolutely brutal Arctic winter.
Yeah.
And to top it all off, little did the 2 know that the emergency transmitter, which was scheduled to go off in case of an emergency, hadn't triggered. So although a search team was out there looking for them, it was entirely in the wrong direction. And as the days went by with nothing to go on, they would soon begin to reconsider their options. A few days into the search, Martin's girlfriend, Susan Haley, flew over from Edmonton to volunteer as a spotter on one of the planes. They hadn't been dating long, and she was much younger than he was, having met after he immigrated to Canada. Along with her father, she encouraged the team to keep going no matter the odds. At the end of the first week, and with nothing sighted, the pilots agreed to broaden the search area to include hills along the Arctic coast as well as the forest near Yellowknife. 5 Twin Otters, 5 Hercules, and several other aircraft made up the search party, and over 300 civilians got involved to help at various points.
I love when the community
Many
comes
even
together.
took turns lying on mattresses inside planes and leaning their heads out the doors to scan for movement. Visibility continued to be poor though, and with only 6 hours of workable daylight per day,
God.
the window for rescue shrank smaller and smaller, and questions grew about why nothing was surfacing. So, by November 27th, in a relentless 19 days of searching, the operation was officially called off to Susan and her father's dismay. It had cost nearly 2 million Canadian dollars, breaking records as the most expensive search and rescue operation in Canadian history. But despite Susan's devastation, she knew inside that Martin was still out there doing whatever he could to survive. Meanwhile, 20 days into their time in the forest, money and aircraft availability weren't the only things that had run out. Martin and David's rations were gone. David did what he could to source food, collecting moss, lichens, and tree bark, and setting traps and snares to catch animals, though these were largely unsuccessful. He melted snow for water, and in their desperation, the 2 even resorted to eating candles from the plane, melting them down and consuming the wax. A pack of cigarettes left behind on the plane provided a little distraction for the 2 survivors, who would chain smoke and talk late into the night to keep up morale.
Isn't one of them a kid?
As the situation grew more dire, David knew he needed more than just the basics if he wanted to make it out of there alive. He was rapidly getting weaker, and having virtually run out of food, he needed to make use of the environment before weakness would completely overcome him.
Did they eat the girl, Judy?
Among the belongings left on the plane were actually a bunch of fishing supplies.
Or Nemi?
But although they had crashed near Hotel Lake, the pair were actually unaware of this, and so these supplies had sat there unused, with David mulling over what to do with them. Eventually, in the last few days of November, he decided to take action. He then took some provisions from the camp and made his way through the bush in search of any lake nearby. In his search, cold, lost, and without navigational equipment, he strayed further and further from the wreckage, but with no sign of water in any direction, he eventually had no choice but to turn back. 51 hours later, David re-emerged, still starving. Tragically, on December 1st, 1972, David died of starvation, with official reports listing his cause of death as despair and malnutrition. He weighed just 75 pounds or 34 kilos, having lost around half his body weight in the several weeks since the crash.
Oh no.
As Martin dealt with the tragic loss and grief of this, reality set in, and he believed his end was also near. He then wrote a letter to his son Pierre back in Germany. He intended for this to be his legacy, as well as seemingly an apology for abandoning him all those years ago. It read, quote, "When you receive this letter, I will be dead. I've had an accident on November 8th, 1972, and I'm still lying in the bush with broken legs. Have no more food. Please forgive me for my sins. I love you, my only son. Please contact Miss Susan Haley, care of Department of Philosophy, University of Alberta, Edmonton, Alberta." She was, for the past year and a half, a close companion. There are savings in the Imperial Bank of Commerce here in Yellowknife and Edmonton. You should have $3,000 and Susan the rest that she may pay her debts and the unpaid ones with court. I am wishing you all the best, and remember me, in my heart I was not all that bad. And with that letter written, Martin Hartwell laid down to die, his mind and body finally giving in to the wilderness and losing all hope. Despite Martin's desperation, though, Susan, on the other hand, was undeterred. She still had a little more fighting spirit left in her and was not planning to stop until Martin was back home. With her father by her side, she begged the search team to resume their efforts. Mimi? There were some strange clues that seemed to indicate Martin's plane was still out there.
Wait, Susan was the wife.
Over the initial 3-week search, at times, aircraft would briefly land upon a distant signal that would then vanish as quickly as it had appeared. It wasn't substantial enough to provide a fixed location, but still something was out there, and with much persuasion, the team agreed to pick up where they left off in the early days of December. On December 7th, an unrelated aircraft also came upon it, but after circling around, failed to find the source. By December 9th, 2 Hercules planes were on the trail of this mystery signal, and eventually pilot Ken Moody spotted something in the tundra. He then sent down 2 paratroopers, as well as a box of food for the lone survivor, fearing the others had died in the weeks prior. However, they discovered that something much more tragic had transpired. Trekking through the snow and ice, it took the 2 men over an hour to reach Martin. He was entirely alone, but in the distance, rescuers saw something that shocked them to their core. At first, they were confused. It looked like a caribou or something, but as they got closer to the camp, they realized the true horror of what lay in front of them. It was instead one of the other passengers, Judy, who had a substantial amount missing from her body. An axe was also propped up beside her. As they approached, Martin said to them, quote, "Welcome to the camp of a cannibal. The others are all gone, I'm the only one left." He had, in absolute desperation, been subsisting on the only food left since the aircraft's rations ran out. This was roughly for the past 10 days, though he hadn't touched the bodies of Nimi or David. Even more surprisingly, as a long-term vegetarian, Martin explained that he had discussed his decision with David and suggested the boy eat some too, but he adamantly refused. It was then that he knew that David wouldn't make it. This was the only way out. And in the end, it was what had gotten him rescued a full 31 days after he had crashed his plane into the bush.
A whole month.
He would then be airlifted to the hospital and given another chance at life. David, on the other hand, was killed by his own kindness. Not only did he refuse to consume the others, but his dedication to Martin also played a part in his passing. Doctors confirmed he likely would have lived longer had he not used most of his energy in helping Martin hunt, eat, and ultimately stay alive. In the aftermath of the crash, an inquest took place, though Martin did not attend and was instead represented by a lawyer, preferring to stay out of the limelight, and especially as the public caught wind of his story and rumors began to spread. The inquest concluded that Martin had not been qualified for the flight as a non-instrument rated pilot with only minor night flying experience. His aircraft too was not adequately equipped, and with the unreliable beacon, this was enough to create an environment in which a crash was all but inevitable.
Wow.
The beacon at the lake was then doubled in power in response to prevent any further incidents, and Martin's license was revoked. The airline, Gateway Aviation, was also found culpable for failing to implement strict enough policies, with its reputation eroded in the process. For too long, they had taken the attitude that crashes were the responsibility of the pilot, but in this case, it was clear that stricter supervision around flight rules, including not permitting non-qualified pilots to fly in conditions needing instrument flight rules, would have made a significant difference. Martin would eventually get his license back and had a career of relatively uneventful flying, with the sole exception of a crash in October of 1987 that left him stranded in the bush again for 2 days. This time, though, there were no fatalities. He then lived out the rest of his life with Susan, who he eventually married, generally keeping out of the public eye before dying at the age of 88. Judy's body, meanwhile, was taken to Banff, where she was cremated and her ashes were scattered by her boyfriend. A memorial fund in her name was also established, with money raised used to train nurses. Nimi left behind a 2-year-old daughter, Denise, who was raised by her grandparents in Spence Bay, who greatly misses her mother, as well as the sister she never got to meet. She and David were buried in a private plot in Edmonton. 14-year-old David Kutuk was remembered as a hero, his selflessness forever immortalized by his posthumous awarding of the esteemed Meritorious Service Cross, given to those who bring great benefit or honor to Canada or the Canadian Forces. And although Martin Hartwell's name is most often associated with this story, it's David who should ultimately be remembered. It was David who facilitated Martin's survival, David who trekked through the bush to bring him food, David who kept him company and ensured he made it home, and David who lost his life in the process.
Yeah, I would have died on day one. Bro, I can't survive. Yeah, actually, honestly, I've seen enough Outdoor Boys videos. I think I would do fine. I think I would do just fine. Anyway,